Brian Shaw's first arm wrestling match has been announced and we're here to talk about it. So, arguably the greatest strongman ever, 4 times world's strongest man, Brian Shaw, is going to arm wrestle Eddie Hall, 1-time world's strongest man and the first man ever to deadlift 500 kilos. So, Brian retired from strongman back in 2023 in August after the Shaw Classic, winning his own competition. And he was then supposed to fight Martin Ford in an MMA, and the fight fell through, and then he went into arm wrestling. So Brian Shaw coming into arm wrestling has made a lot of fans saying rest in peace Levon, but as real arm wrestlers know, that would only be the chance after years of hard work from Brian. He would have to start somewhere, which he now has, to many people's excitement. For the last year or so, it's been a big question mark, who's going to be Brian Shaw's first match? We'll talk about different opponents afterwards, but now we'll talk about this match announced. King of the Table 13 it is, 14th of December in the United States. Brian Shaw against Eddie Hall, and King of the Table 13 will include arm wrestlers such as John Bursenk, Devon Larratt, and the headliner of the comp, Levin Sagnashvili versus Jerry Caderet. Both Eddie Hall and Brian Shaw is of course some of the strongest men to ever walk the earth. But when it comes to arm wrestling, they both have minimal to no experience, but they do have some, and we're going to take a look at it. So if we go back to 2019, we got to see Eddie Hall arm wrestle Vytautas Lalas, which is a former arm wrestler and a strongman, and they did this in front of 8,000 spectators at a Giants live show. Little did we know if Lalas was just playing or if Eddie actually gave him some match. But in the end, Eddie didn't stand a chance and Vytautas beat Eddie in that arm wrestling match. Then, 3 years later, 2022, we got to see Eddie Hall arm wrestle Larry Wheels. And Larry had been into arm wrestling a couple of years already. And also here, you could see that Eddie Hall did not stand a chance. If we move the focus to Brian, we already saw Brian bringing arm wrestle table back to his private gym 2 years ago. But it was firstly this year we started seeing some content from him doing arm wrestling specific strength stuff. We first got to see Brian doing some specific arm wrestling training on the table 7 months ago, so around the March time. Then just 2 months later in June this year, we got to see him do an awesome collab with Devon Larratt. That was when I really felt things was getting serious and we could see that Brian had made some improvements. Ever since their collab, we've seen frequent arm wrestling videos from Brian showing us more and more of his new arm wrestling additions to his gym. And this made a lot of people start talking about Brian's first match and who it will be. So a couple of weeks ago, Eddie was the first person to share on his Instagram that he had a match set with Brian in the end of 2024. And to be honest, my immediate thought was that this was bullshit. He wasn't going to arm wrestle Brian. This was because, in my first opinion, I don't think that Eddie stand a chance against Brian. I based this on different things. First, I could say that forearm grip power, which is arguably one of the factors for being a good arm wrestler, this was always Brian's strength in strongman. And for Eddie Hall, grip was his weakness. Secondly, we do have some table time over the years between them to go out from. The first time we got to see Brian go up against Eddie Hall on arm wrestling table was back in 2019 at the same Giants Live. They did this left-handed. This time you could actually see that Eddie was more aware of how to arm wrestle than Brian. But even with this taken into account for, Brian looked strong. Like Eddie didn't stand a chance even here. Then 2022, we got to see them play again, this time at Brian's gym. And this time around, Brian was in a much better position than Eddie. So in this video, it's not too clear, but then we got to see them arm wrestle again May of this year. And it's very clear that Eddie is no match for Brian. So I mean, if this was the starting point, and then you take into consideration that after Strongman, Eddie hasn't been able to focus on one thing solely, and in addition,
When I get into something, I get into something, and I don't know any other way.
when Brian says he's getting into arm wrestling,
I can't go in halfway.
as we all know, Brian is very strong, and we've seen him strengthen his pronator, his cupping, etc. But if there's one thing he needs to focus on, is getting in a lot of table time. And in the last video, Brian himself said that
Have a great group of guys now that is coming on a weekly basis.
clearly Brian is fully aware that
My table IQ needs to go up. I'm putting in a lot of table
in
time.
the last podcast between Brian from May month this year, Eddie said that
I could do a bit of arm wrestling training.
following up with,
Fancy a match in about 6 months, me and you?
and he believes
I feel like I could do you 6 months training. You want to find out?
there's nothing to say on Eddie's confidence, but most people believe that those quotes were just talk. Then Brian reveals,
Eddie Hall's going to be the start.
and that
He can be the sacrificial lamb.
he's just,
Looking at Eddie as a stepping stone.
it's now very clear this will be Brian Shaw's first official match in arm wrestling, and a lot of people believes it's a walkover for Brian, me included. Who could be better opponents for Brian? In my opinion, I think one opponent could be Lalas, which went against Eddie back in 2019. Another one could be World's Strongest Man Magnus Samuelsson, which was a former arm wrestler, which broke Nathan Jones' arm at the World's Strongest Man 25 years ago. I think Lawrence Chalet would be a great fit. And probably another one who could have been a good match for Brian, and I'm sure he thinks so himself, is Brandon Allen. But then again, Eddie Hall is more famous, he has more followers. So, yeah, maybe that's one thing, just to make the hype even bigger, bring more eyes into arm wrestling. Another thing is that Eddie Hall, I mean, a lot of people think it's a walkover for Brian, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing that Brian get to secure a win in his first match. I don't know. Anyway, guys,
It is going down here in the United States, December 14th.
let me know in the comment section, what do you think about the fight? Thank you for watching.
Eddie will most likely be heading to the hospital after we are done. King of the Table 13.